Good afternoon. I'm Dave Denoon, and I'm very pleased to be moderating today's session. The principal role of a moderator is to make sure that things move smoothly, and I'll try to do that. What I've said to each of our speakers is that we want them to speak for something like 6 to 8 minutes to get started, give us an overview of their ideas, and then we'll try to get as lively a discussion going with the audience as we can. So we're going to go in the order as it's listed here. So we're going to start with Steve Noerper, then Kuyoun Chung, and then James Person. Each of them has extensive background on the subject, and obviously we're starting with a more abstract question of reunification, and then in the second panel we're going to be turning our attention to the actual security issues. So would you please welcome Steve Noerper.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you, Ambassador. And really, it's a delight to be here with especially two thought leaders, and Noel Lateef and David Denoon are why I like living in New York City and following international affairs. So thank you both. Thank all of you, because this is such a pertinent set of issues, as we know, not only from our media read, but as I remind my students at Columbia, these are really the fundamental issues of war and peace for 2017. Now, David has just rightly pointed out that we're to lead with unification, and we appreciate KINU's support. I would like to offer a few sort of unification observations very quickly. Perhaps we can flesh them out a bit later, because I believe that the unification thought and scenarios are very much linked to the current impasse, and they're both complicating factors. They both condition our ability to deal in the immediate term with the crises we have before us, as well as in the longer term. And here's what I mean by that. What we will have with the unification scenario is a divergence of interests among major powers who all stand on their own ground with different perspectives on where the Korean Peninsula ultimately will be. And in many ways that impedes progress to resolve where we are now in terms of the current impasse and the current high level of tensions on the peninsula. And the challenges offered by North Korea, as the ambassador outlined, in terms of the missile and the nuclear development and the rapidity of that technological development and its evolution will necessarily condition where things are with unification. Now, unification is probably not a word that you have seen much in media reporting, certainly not in the current 18 months of really intense step-up in tensions in the region. And there has been one major address, that by the current President Moon Jae-in in Berlin, which is well worth your looking for, because he outlines in very astute ways a means of going forward. And his address in Berlin talking about unification was also an effort to de-escalate the tensions that we see right now. It was, in the opinion of some observers, a last step before talk of military strikes, etc., gathers steam. And so it's important, and it behooves us to listen to the South Korean leadership and voice on this, because it's a very clear statement of where Moon Jae-in and the current South Korean government feels we can go. The divergence of interest. Right now, we're at a state of impasse with North Korea, meaning the United States and North Korea. Right? This is the primary predicament for U.S. foreign policy, as handed over from the Obama administration to the Trump administration, and bar none currently defined as a chief national security concern. And where we are in terms of the alarm around the rapid nuclear and missile development is such that we've seen this volley of missiles. We've seen missiles over Japan. We've seen the miniaturization. We've seen reentry technology. And now we are faced with the fact that we have a nuclear North Korea, for better want of a word. And even though the nations don't want to recognize it as a nuclear state, de facto, that's what we're dealing with. So in terms of the unification challenge, where do we go in terms of this denuclearization issue? Because isn't part of our view of a unified Korean peninsula to be a nuclear-free zone, to be a non-nuclear united Korea? And so in that sense, it's very much part and parcel of the unification question. A second aspect is the divergence of interest. So right now, in terms of the current impasse, while we have had unanimity in the Security Council in terms of these resolutions, it does not look like there will be further support in the near term by China nor by Russia. And they play actually different roles, and I want to make that very clear because that will also come into play in the unification scenario. So China and Russia, both traditional allies of North Korea, don't feel that there should be a further step up to address the current concerns. They have, though, been supportive of the most recent measures. North Korea doesn't feel, in the current impasse, that it is interested in negotiating away its capability. And so, in essence, we have a divergence of strategic perspectives. So you have a North Korea that is looking for legitimacy, that is arguing that it needs deterrence against the superior US and ROK forces. You have a Moscow that can play the role of a spoiler in terms of trying to intercede when it's convenient, but with the current state of poor US-Russia relations is not willing to go further to help. Whereas in a normal US-Russia relationship, we could be talking about cooperation on North Korea as we look toward unification. And the third aspect of China is that we seem to be comfortable to say that China has the solution here. We put all the eggs in the China basket. In my argument, we should stop looking at the Korean Peninsula strictly through the Sino-US lens, which is the primary lens that we do look at Korean Peninsular affairs. And we need to be specific with China. So there are roles that China and Russia can play, both in terms of immediate crisis management and as we step toward unification, at least as outlined by the current administration. And the Secretary General has used his good office to call for greater cooperation and coordination among the great powers, China, Russia, and the United States. And then lastly, Japan, which is the other regional actor I've not mentioned. And clearly there we have a conservative administration that may be reinforced with Abe's re-election on the 22nd, and that has conservative instincts necessarily born of the flyovers of the missiles and the level of fear now in Japan about what that has meant. But we also have, in the longer term, questions of where Japan lies relative to its unification perspective. So you have to ask yourself, and I'll close on this, which nations feel that a divided Korean Peninsula and the persistence of the status quo is in their interest? Well, there's a lot of arguments that almost all nations favor that because that's a strategic buffer for China. It provides a convenience for Russia, etc. But if there is common agreement in terms of a movement toward unification, and if there is accommodations over time, it will require a recalibration and a refocus from the different capitals, because right now it's not at all clear that a united peninsula is something, despite official pronouncement, that they firmly grasp. So I would just like to end on that trying to remember that unification is part and parcel of this current strategic predicament that we're in, and to try to seek solutions in terms of negotiation, seek solutions in terms of de-escalation, perhaps seek a moratorium, but also remember that for the North Koreans, they'll want something, and the developmental context that comes with unification, whether that's economic assistance, infrastructure, energy, and other types of development, are the things that the international community will have to work on together. And so there may be, in the end, an out in terms of the negotiation process by taking a longer-term view of unification and steps forward in terms of integration on the Korean Peninsula.
Okay. Thank you, Steve. Kuyoun?
Thank you. Thank you for having me here today, and I'm really honored to have an opportunity to make positions on unifications. So basically today I will discuss more about South Korea's position on unifications and deliver how it will actually affect the prospect of unifications vis-a-vis its diverging relationship and diverging interest with other countries. So basically South Korea's unification policy has been based on 1989 National Community Unification Formula. even though there has been many ups and downs and many changes in administrations, this formula has been kind of inherited consistently from administration to administrations. And current Moon Jae-in administration also share this view of national community unification formula. So basically this formula argues that there should be a three-stage functional list, and there's a gradual process of unifications, which consists of reconciliation between two Koreas, confederation stage, which means that peaceful coexistence of two Koreas, then gradually moving into a unification stage. So there should be three stages, functional list, and gradual process of unification. That has been kind of big idea of South Korea that has been inherited for about more than like 30 years. So Moon Jae-in administration also inherited that, and recently Stephen mentions about it. His idea of unification is more toward to de-escalating these current tensions in Korean Peninsula. Basic idea is that improving inter-Korean relationship in spite of this nuclear crisis. Improving inter-Korean relationship might help to de-escalate and create some opportunity for diplomatic solutions of denuclearizations. And at the same time, de-escalation might pave a way to reconciliation, which is a first stage of unification formula. And at the same time, it will create more peaceful environment. We can build a unification process. In other words, it is not just about inter-Korean relationship, but the Northeast Asia in general. There should be a more supportive environment that every members in Northeast Asia has to be agree with this peaceful unification idea. So that is the Moon Jae-in administration's idea, which is actually conflicting with Trump administration's current North Korea policy. So Trump administration's policy is not necessarily about unification, but is more about North Korea policy, and especially specific to a denuclearization process, which is termed as maximum pressure and engagement. The problem is maximum pressure engagement does not necessarily means more military solutions. All options are on the table, but at the same time, the priority has been given to diplomatic solutions. But the difference between South Korea and United States is that South Korea has been more toward appeasing North Korea to get into the table. But United States is more toward to coercive actions and to change their view and change their policy options to de-escalations, denuclearizations. The problem is North Korea's motivations behind this nuclear test and ballistic missile test. So basically, North Korea's motivation is not about peaceful unifications. They have their own idea of unifications, which is totally different from national community unification formula that has been inherited in South Korea. And the reason why they develop a nuclear weapon is to make their regime survive, and at the same time create more hospitable environment for their unification on their own terms. So given that three countries conflicting idea about a nuclear weapon, at the same time unifications, so it is creating more kind of pessimistic prospect for the peaceful unifications. So basically, it is important to understand that when it comes to denuclearizations, there has been diverging interest and diverging strategies among these 6 countries around the Korean Peninsula. At the same time, when it comes to unifications, it is totally different understanding for 6 countries as well. So unifications and denuclearization is totally different end state and totally different policy objectives. And each of these 6 countries have different ideas. The good thing is, as North Korea's nuclear capability and ballistic missile launch capability is increasing and more provocative, the disparity between these 6 countries' idea is kind of narrowing down. But still, even though it is narrowing down, but that does not mean that there is a consensus over how we can denuclearize North Korea and how we can create more good environment for unifications. So Considering all of these factors, the thing is, from South Korea's perspectives, the end state in South Korea or Korean Peninsula is that there will be two hostile Koreas which do not share any view on formula of unification. And there is a nuclear North Korea which do not dialogue with South Korea. They only care about United States relationship. So South Korea's perspective is pretty imperative. It's not like we are achieving unification in the short term or in the long term, given that there is a nuclear North Korea. But at the same time, this Northeast Asia's security landscape will be more inhospitable and more toward to geopolitical conflict. So the solutions to resolve or to solution to get over this conundrum, security conundrum, is to change North Korea's mind, whatever the solution would be, to change their mind to denuclearize. At the same time, narrow the gap between the 6 countries' interests when it comes to unification at the same time. So I'll stop here and take over.
Thank you, Kuyoun. James?
Great. Thank you very much to the Foreign Policy Association, to KINU, Ambassador Kim, lovely to see you. I'm a historian. I get a little uncomfortable when it comes to making predictions. So I think I'm instead going to take stock of where we are, some of the challenges that are presently provided by key stakeholders. And for the sake of time, though, I'm going to focus on just the DPRK, on China, on the ROK and the U.S. Well, despite our hopes, the actual prospects of near-term unification seem as distant as ever. Achieving the goal of unification will require overcoming major obstacles, the least of which is the fact that was already alluded to, that there is no common North-South Korean vision for what a unified Korean state would look like. While North Korea did propose, starting in 1960, a confederal system of some sort. This was at a time when the North Korean economy was doing much better than that of South Korea. This concept of a confederation shifted over time. In 1971, it was proposed again by the North Koreans at a time when the economies were roughly equal, although South Korea was already pulling ahead. But by 1991, when the North Koreans again proposed this confederation system, it was really to stave off absorption. This is, to remind you, just after Germany, West Germany absorbed East Germany. Today, I think it's pretty clear that North Korea will not accede to its own demise and absorption. The DPRK presents another obstacle with, as Stephen mentioned, the nuclear program. I do disagree with those, and you hear this a lot in Washington, particularly among Defense Department circles, that the nuclear program is really designed to provide a shield behind which North Korea will divide the U.S.-ROK alliance and force the U.S. off the peninsula and then carry out unification on its own terms. I disagree with this because I think there's just too much history to call upon to support the idea that there is, for North Korea, to their mind at least, a credible defensive rationale behind their pursuit of a nuclear program. It really goes back to the early 60s when they determined that the Soviet Union, which provided a nuclear umbrella for Pyongyang, was not credible. And that they needed to take their own national defense in their own hands. And this is something that's been reinforced over the years. And this view of the world as being inherently predatory and malign was extended not just toward their perceived foe, the United States, but even toward their allies, the Soviet Union and China. China is another obstacle. China will not do our bidding and bring North Korea to its knees to force them back to the negotiating table. They won't do anything to destabilize North Korea. You often hear because of the refugee crisis. I don't think that's the major issue. I mean, the Chinese can handle it, a refugee crisis. Now, I think The concern of increasing the population of ethnic Koreans in Northeast China is a concern because of the potential for this irredentist claim to territory that even Mao Zedong recognized was traditionally Korean. It's fascinating to see conversations between Mao and Kim Il-sung, for example, when Mao would actually say, well, traditionally this was Korean territory, and even suggested that at some point Korea could manage the territory. But China, I think, doesn't want a nuclear North Korea, but even more than that, it doesn't want a unified Korean peninsula that is a treaty ally of the United States. It doesn't want a treaty ally of the United States at its doorstep at a time when China is reasserting its traditional hegemony in the region, when it's trying to create this zone of deference where countries on its border do not do anything to upset or to challenge Beijing's regional interests. I want to just mention, I'm really troubled by some of the discussion I hear about the Finlandization of the Korean Peninsula. I first heard this a couple of years ago from a Russian scholar, but I'm hearing it now even in the U.S., talking about a grand bargain between the U.S. and China to neutralize the Korean Peninsula and as a way of bringing about unification. And this is troubling, I think, because this is just another justification for Koreans thinking of themselves as the shrimp among whales, and another, I think, it would be another historical injustice where Korea lost its sovereignty because of big powers, was divided because of big powers. We cannot let big powers then to decide that the Koreas will be neutralized to bring about unification. I mean, especially when a non-aligned Korea would then, its fate would be in the hands of a hegemonic China. And when you look at the history of Korea's relations with China going back to the dynasties, and then more recently China's relationship with North Korea, I can tell you that this is the last thing that would be the last thing that would be in the interest of the Koreans. For the ROK, I think what we're seeing with President Moon's policies is a vast improvement over what we saw with President Park. President Park, I have to say, there was some benefit to this, to her policy of talking about the benefits of national unification. Though I think it was a surprise even to her Minister of Unification at the time that she used the word 대박 or bonanza to describe unification. But there were benefits to highlighting it was good to highlight the benefits of unification because you have a younger generation in Korea that doesn't have direct family ties or even memories of family or a unified Korean state. So there was a real benefit to that. However, I feel that the government was in some ways creating this narrative or constructing a narrative of imminent collapse in North Korea with these stories of high-level defectors coming across the border and each one of these being in the press. This is something that had happened consistently, but these defectors were instead being shuffled into the National Intelligence Services think tank where they were being used to learn about what's going on inside the regime, but instead they were being exploited to show that again that collapse was imminent, and this only served to antagonize the North, to really push us further away from stage one of this unification strategy from 1989, which is reconciliation. President Moon, I think, is doing a much better job of that. He's really trying to improve inter-Korean relations, trying to get us back on track to reconciliation, to stage one. And this is necessary to overcome the tremendous differences between North and South Korea, economic differences, cultural differences, And without communication, without contact, when unification does happen, it's going to be extremely challenging. But the major challenge for President Moon right now is the tough relationship, or the tense and worsening relationship between the United States and North Korea. And I think the U.S., we can say, with some certainty that the United States remains committed to unification. As this is a priority. We fully support unification of Korea, but certainly the growing conflict, personal in many ways, conflict between President Trump and Kim Jong-un is not doing anything to help President Moon achieve his goals. Thank you.
Thanks. Okay. We have roughly half an hour. We're going to go a little bit after 6 o'clock for this discussion. So I think we should be able to get a broad range of questions out. But my first admonition, please, is ask a question and don't give a speech. So if you have a question, raise your hand and I'll call on you and we'll get started. Right here. Would you please stand and identify yourself?
My name is Rick Armstrong. I teach at Kingsborough Community College, and I was just wondering if you have any insights on the leadership of North Korea. It's the great mystery. Do any of you know anything that we don't know through the media?
Could you elaborate the question?
Yeah. He's saying about the leadership of North Korea other than Kim Jong-un. Do you want to say anything about it?
No, I don't think there is actually formal information about it. But yeah, the official position is that there is Kim Jong-un leadership, and that's it. Yeah.
David,
Okay.
Yeah.
Do you want to?
Yeah.
yeah. So, the question is, what are we not reading? What do we not know? A few different things. One is, and this was reinforced in a lunch I had with a North Korean yesterday, who is very close to the foreign minister and very close to the head of the State Council on Foreign Affairs, the former foreign minister. And as I listened for well over an hour of his analysis of the current leadership dynamics, I walked away from it in a sentence or two saying that it is very split. There is a great deal of elite factionalism in North Korea, and that can be both an advantage and disadvantage to us. Clearly, despite all of the focus on the consolidation of power under the young leader, under Kim Jong-un, there's a reason why he's needing to continue to appear to consolidate, right? And you can look at things like the naming of his sister to the Politburo as evidence of his further ability to consolidate. But from all reports, if you look at 140 to 160 people purged, there may be pockets of resentment. And clearly, in terms of the way that the North Korean leadership has historically developed, there's a lot of vertical structure, and there's a lot of stovepiping. And that means you have rivalries and interest, and there's contests to please the young leader. And on the good side, that means that there may be opportunities to create inroads, and there may be pockets of resentment that become more apparent over time. The negative of that is it creates a level of instability. And so we don't know, for example, in terms of nuclear control, command and control structures, exactly what it looks like. And we do know that about 3 weeks ago, there were reports that in Pyongyang there was a meeting to reinforce command and control protocol. And what that might say is, well, they're just simply reinforcing their structure. What that says to me as a political scientist is there was a problem there. There's a problem in the structure, and there can be levels of competition. So we need to be careful not to just think it's one guy sitting there calling all the shots, despite the KCNA, the official state media pronouncements, and all the imagery with all of the tests that go with it. It's much more nuanced. What we have a problem with as Americans, since the focus of this group is on U.S. policy, is we really don't have good inroads with North Korean leadership. And that's problematic. We need to try to open those dialogues, open hotlines and open dialogues with as many levels as we possibly can across senior North Korea society.
After. After.
No.
Just one comment. When it comes to leadership, I add more comments after Stephen. Is that after several weeks ago, there has been an announcement from the North Korean governments that there is kind of enforcement of his leadership, and basically his leadership is supported by Baekdu Hyolton, which is a blood inherited leadership from his grandfathers. And even though there has been competing interest and conflicting interests inside bureaucrats and number of executive branches, there has been coherencies when it comes to North Korean leadership, and that cannot be really dominantly disrupted by any types of interest. So even though there has been many hints that there will be some kind of conflict of interest from upper level and down level, of course there is a diverging interest. And it is not just limited to North Korea, but any countries have that kind of diverging interest as well. When we talk to North Korean people, even though not just during these days, lower level officials, like working level officials, are pretty workable when we discuss any issues, especially like development assistance or humanitarian aid. They are really workable and approachable, and they are willing to cooperate with others. But when there is a kind of diversity, and that might mean diversity, but at the same time, even though they have conflict of interest, the bottom line is that they will follow the Kim Jong-un leadership, so which is based on their blood inherited leaderships.
And the monolithic ideological system, which
yes.
was established in 1967 by his grandfather Kim Il-sung, who didn't really brook criticism well and saw debate and discussion within the party not as a strength or something that strengthened decisions, but something that would challenge the national security imperatives of the leader. I think we're looking at the same thing.
Okay. In the back?
Good evening, Andy Laub from Young Professionals in Foreign Policy. Thank you all for being here and for your remarks. I wanted to ask, I think all of us were shocked and saddened that watched North Korea in what happened to Otto Warmbier. And I just wanted to get your read, are there any broader strategic implications given that the brutality of the regime was on such unique display for the world to see? Thank you.
Steve?
Yes, and I think, the tragedy around Otto Warmbier is such that it has moved everyone in this country at the popular level and at the special interest and scholarly and official levels, to be extremely dismayed by that type of behavior and to think about the potential, as his family has recently said, for torture as well. There are demands for accountability, and I would emphasize that we shouldn't move away from those demands for accountability. Because we're supposed to be talking about unification aspects, I would venture to say that there will be larger questions of accountability in the future. And Otto Warmbier, if this can happen to an American, you can imagine what happens to North Koreans in the gulag within North Korea. And whether that's 120 or 140,000, do look at the 2014 United Nations Commission of Inquiry report. But we know that they compared it to Nazi-era atrocities, and so it behooves us all, as much as we talk about nuclear and missile issues, to remember there's a broader question of human rights. And when it comes to unification and what South Korea will have to manage, the question of transitional justice and accountability will be high, and there is currently a United Nations Center working in Seoul to document the atrocities of the North Korean regime.
Over here, on the right. Could you wait for the mic, please?
Yes, one of the things that it took a long time in Germany was
Could you
the question.
identify yourself, please?
Sorry, Jonathan Honig. Was the question of what was actually going to be the out-of-pocket, was going to be the impact in West Germany. And my question to you is the same debate occurring in South Korea? Do people have a sense of the size of it, what would be involved, and whether there is domestic appetite for doing that?
When it comes to unifications. So basically, there has been every year we kind of make a poll about what do you think about unifications, and there has been 3 different types of responses in South Korea, and the most recent observation is that younger generations are identified as isolationist. In other words, they do not really care about unifications, not because they have really big connection to the North Korean people, because they haven't experienced Korean wars and they didn't really have a direct contact to North Korean people. And given that there is economic stagnations and there is they have more priority of economic, getting a jobs and economic developments, and they really do not have any time for unification. So unification is kind of a long story, and the more North Korea make a provocations and launch a missile test, the less they have interest in unifications, and they see North Korea as they do not see North Korea as a partner to working with in the future. So from that aspect, the previous Park Geun-hye administrations tried to create the narrative that unification is not a bad thing, and unification can be a bonanza or 대박. So it was a narrative, and it usually it worked a little bit well in the first 2 years before North Korea tested forcing North Korean nuclear test. But after that, the North Korea policy has been dramatically changed to a more coercive way in South Korea. So the narrative has been kind of faded away. But this Moon Jae-in administrations is not like create that kind of narrative, but at the same time, more directly look at the reality, that this is the reality, but we have a willingness to improve the relationship. And this improvement will pave the way for peaceful unifications, and unifications, as we already know, that it will be kind of another kind of opportunity to make South Korea much stronger and much bigger countries in Northeast Asia. So we know that, but we just need to create more willingness and raise awareness one more time, I guess.
One of the challenges to really assessing just how much unification will cost is the inability to really find out just what is going on inside North Korea, what conditions are actually like. We don't have the most reliable data from the North Koreans, and again, we can't get in there and assess the costs of unification. I mean, there were efforts starting with President Lee Myung-bak, to create a unification tax and to start preparing for this, because they do recognize that the cost is going to be enormous. I mean, nothing like with East and West Germany, where you were dealing with two strong, where East Germany wasn't a complete basket case. So they do recognize it's going to be challenging, but we just don't know exactly how much yet.
So I want to add more something. So that's why President Park actually created this Northeast Asia Fund, which is connected to AIIB. AIIB does not really cover Northeast Asian regions. So President Park, a previous administration, suggests that it might be helpful to create some kind of pooled fund to gather fund from regional countries and prepare for the unification cases. But that has been dissipated after the nuclear test.
Okay, here, lady. Wait for the mic, please.
Hello, my name is Yolanda Barrios. So this begs the question, what do each of you consider to be the benefits of unification given these huge costs?
Steve, you want to start?
Yeah, the benefit of unification is peace and stability for Northeast Asia, which as it stands now is the most economically dynamic and in some aspects most politically significant part of our globe right now, and certainly among the leaders on that. The peace and prosperity for the Korean people and the ahistoric reality of the division of this last century it needs to be rectified. And so there is a moral duty and a moral sensibility to see a unified Korean peninsula. And it's the desire of the Korean people, obviously, and one needs to stand near the DMZ or to talk to older Koreans who have borne division and what that has meant. And then one has an understanding really of a nation divided and the emotive nature of this. So we in the international community owe our thought and our support for that process, just whatever the expense will be, and to try to find a way to facilitate that, most likely on Seoul's terms. But certainly, while it's a Korean solution for a Korean divide, the international community can be of tremendous support.
I can't say it any better than that. I agree 100%.
And actually, unification will provide a huge benefit to all the Northeast Asian countries. Because of North Korea's consistent nuclear test and ballistic missile test, the region nearby, like Far Eastern Russia and northeast side of China, has been less developed. Nobody wants to live there. Nobody wants to start a business in that area because of that North Korea risk. And South Korea, to mitigate that kind of risk, has been suggesting a number of economic initiatives. The last administration has suggested Eurasia Initiative, which connects South Korea to Europe, from railroad and other natural resource connections, and that will kind of create another boost to economic revive in Northeast Asia regions. And this Moon Jae-in administration also has similar idea. There should be some kind of connection from South Korea, North Korea, Russia, and China to Europe in the end. So that kind of connection has been blocked by North Korea. So unification will provide some kind of that kind of economy revivement, at the same time more stable security relationship.
Okay, here, near the door.
Hi, my name is Fernando Braga. My question is about voices within China that are more aggressive in terms of thinking about the idea of reunification and the possibility that a regime that is hostile to China, and there was a United States Institute of Peace brief last month discussing the idea that China might prevent reunification and install a Chinese-friendly government that is not the Kim Jong-un regime. Could you just talk about that roadblock to reunification? Thank you.
Sure. I mean, certainly, you do hear of scholars, for example, making or giving talks about the relationship with North Korea. For example, Shin Zhihua of East China Normal University, suggesting that in fact South Korea is the better ally. The problem with this scenario of China installing a new leader is how the North Korean people would perceive this, and how those who are not Kim Jong-un in leadership circles, how they would perceive this. And I have to tell you, there's, again, as a historian having looked at documents from former communist archives now for a very long time, I can tell you there is a profound sense of mistrust that is just throughout the North Korean people toward China, and this perception that China has been overly interventionist. And if we had the time, I'd go through this long list of events or incidents when China did directly meddle in North Korean affairs. And beyond that, there's this perception in North Korea that China has never really abandoned this Middle Kingdom mentality and has always treated it as sort of the vassal state. Something that the rest of the region is now beginning to experience. But the North Koreans have been dealing with this for over 6 decades now. So that sense of mistrust, which again is throughout the North Korean leadership, with the exception of perhaps the uncle who was killed in 2013, which I think likely brought an end to any people in the leadership who were in support of improving relations and developing those ties with China. I just don't see that the North Koreans themselves would stand for China's intervention, and I don't think we should either, for that matter. I mean, I think it's the Korean people, the people of South Korea that should be in the driver's seat on this, and working together to find a solution. It's not for, again, for the China and the United States to determine the future of the Korean Peninsula.
Over here, in the middle, the man in the dark suit. Okay. No, no.
Hi, Joe Lafredo from China Merchants Bank. As a representative of a Chinese bank, I have an interesting perspective on this. You know, and just Chinese have voted for 2 of the resolutions, and I can tell you from the inside, the Chinese banks, especially the major ones that are operating in the United States, are taking this very, very seriously. They're trying to pierce through the web of all the front companies, the shell companies, to try to root out financial transactions with North Korea. I just want to get your perspective as to whether you think this is going to be effective and how North Korea is going to finance itself. The reality is that China has been the biggest trading partner. If that disappears, where does the money come from and what are the implications?
James?
Certainly, there is an ongoing effort, and I have no doubt that China is going to continue this, but you know, there will be cosmetic efforts to deal with the North Koreans, but I don't think that China will ever do enough to bring North Korea to its knees, which is essentially what we want them to do. We want the North Koreans to be convinced that the cost of their nuclear program is just too high and that they have to return to the negotiating table to abandon this. It's just not in China's broader interests to do this, to carry the water for the United States. And the Chinese, again, just don't want they want that buffer zone. They don't like a nuclear North Korea, but more importantly, they don't want to lose that strategic buffer zone that North Korea provides. I just cannot be convinced that China is ever going to do enough to bring North Korea to its knees and to convince it that it needs to abandon its nuclear program, which for the North Koreans is non-negotiable. Again, going back to the 60s, they've seen this as a vital component of their national security policy. I mean, it took them a long time to actually develop it, but they see, you know, that for them there is a credible defensive rationale to this program.
Yeah, just very quickly, in addition, there is no love lost right now between Beijing and Pyongyang. We need to understand that, because if the U.S. expectation is that that's how this problem will be solved, that's not a good read on our part. And the fact of the matter is, Chinese banks are avoiding it. Chinese trading organizations are avoiding North Korea. They don't want to run afoul of U.S. Treasury. And they have considered North Korea irritants for a long time, but there is no affection for this young leader. You know, you can couch it in lots of different analyses, but this princeling is not one in favor. So they do have an ability to control that, and James's argument is spot on in terms of they're not wanting to leverage to a point of instability, but they're growingly disillusioned. And they're also very concerned about this missile and nuclear technology. They just don't say so publicly. It puts a lot of China at risk in the event of some sort of miscalculation or tumult or political instability, and I've heard that from PLA, People's Liberation Army military intelligence analysts. They would never say this publicly, but they're absolutely concerned about what it means. And now, with the high yields of this latest nuclear test, what that meant in terms of earthquakes being felt within China, and whatever compromises have been done in terms of the geology of that area, it's something we should be concerned about. And of course, mention of an atmospheric test, that doesn't make China happy either.
There's a man over here in a light suit, yeah, right in the middle. It looks light to me.
Okay. Tad Ogden here. Tell me, is there any, well, what I will call historic, ethnic, or political division between North and South Korea that's underlying this, that keeps them apart?
Yeah.
Ken?
You can go. No, you go ahead. No, go ahead.
There is no historical justification for the division between the North and South. It is, the Korean Peninsula has been a unified state for at least 1,000 years. And again, it was divided because of the decision to, in 1945 to temporarily divide, but growing tensions between the United States and the Soviet Union led to a permanent division of the state when the joint Soviet-U.S. committee could not agree on constitute, or who would constitute a provisional government for Korea, and as a result of the emerging Cold War conflict, the peninsula was divided. But again, there is no historical justification for this.
But there are strong regionalisms that do go back a long period, and those are within South Korea and within North Korea, and clearly will be an aspect of a united peninsula.
Okay. I think we have time for one more question. In the far back.
Thanks. My name is Sun Yu. I'm a Korean living in the U.S. There is a long history of discussion for the reunification since 1945, but at this point, nuclear armed North Korea became a reality. That's another topic, but I wonder if it fundamentally changes the proposition of this talk of reunification, whether it is a still useful framework to bring about the engaging North and South and interested nations otherwise. Is it not more useful to more focus about the peaceful coexistence of two different states?
Well, at this moment, actually, unification is not a kind of good strategy way to elicit this dialogue between two Koreas, not only two Koreas, but overall in international community, because North Korea is not interested in dialogue in the first place for the denuclearizations, and at the same time, North Korea is not interested in unification from South Korea's term, which is based on national community unification formula, which because accepting that formula, gradual 3 stages, functionalist formula means that they have to change their system in a democratic way. Because our way is about making a democratic, peaceful countries unified by a more peaceful way. But their way is not necessarily conceived. The ultimate end state of unified Korea is democratic countries. They are just, as I said, they want survival of their regime. Their regime is not democratic.
I think we should wrap up and give adequate time for the second panel. Would any of the panelists like to make any summary comments? Steve?
No, I just wanted to point out something that was mentioned early, but it's another takeaway, things that aren't oft reported. Generational change. Keep your eye on what's happening. The new generations of South Koreans have different expectations, different concerns. They tend to be jobs. They tend to be pocketbook issues. They're concerned about their future. North Korea, to them on the ground in South Korea, is a very distant concern, and they view it as much more remote, country cousins. And to add to that, North Korean millennials. There is a new generation of North Koreans. They did not know Kim Il-sung, some did not know Kim Jong-il, and they have different levels of expectation. They want cell phones, even if it's an internet. They want luxury goods. They may have rising expectations over time or different expectations. So keeping a focus on generational change is something that we don't often talk about, but is really important for transition on the peninsula and ultimately unification.
Thank you.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, I just want to add that for the next panel, we're going to discuss more about nuclear issues and security issues as well. South Korea's point of view is that how we resolve these nuclear issues will determine how we will reach the unification process, because that is actually about the starting point of reconciliation in the first place. So I hope the next panel will be more productive as well.
Good. Can we thank our panelists?